Don't serve Achech, the dragon of Egypt. Serve the leader of Us. And there's an equivalence there. It makes sense at moments when you realize that Yahweh sees himself in peer-to-peer competition with other powerful ones in the land. None of that makes sense when you think you're reading a story of Almighty God from beginning to end. It all makes sense when you peel off that final layer of editing from the 6th century BCE, go to the root meanings, the names on the planet's surface, each dominating their own human colonies and bumping up against each other in competition for resources and hegemony. That's the actual story of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures. And all through that period, you can hear prophets and kings trying to erase the knowledge of these other entities, trying to clean up Judaism so that it will be monotheistic. But for most of that period, it is not monotheistic. It's polytheistic, henotheistic, and you use the root meanings, and we're not talking about theistic things at all. We're talking about ETs and our struggles with them in the deep past. So that's the problem. If the Old Testament is a story of colonization, okay, we can understand it. We can get our head around that. But the moment you don't allow yourself to read it that way, that you pretend that Elohim means God, you've then got to justify all these violent behaviors as the behavior of a loving, transcendent God. So it's now God who's doing the colonizing, God who's doing the bullying, God who's punitive, can turn it on a dime, will punish your family to the 7th generation for a mistake you might make, that will slaughter people who are actually trying to serve him. It's monstrous behavior. And if you have to worship the entity that you've now credited with that behavior, if you worship a God who will do genocide, you have to justify genocide. And you've just done something to your own conscience in that moment. If you worship a God who is xenophobic, you will justify xenophobia, and you've done something to your own moral compass. And you can draw a straight line from that translation choice that says these are God's stories, a straight line from that through history to all the enslavements, colonizations, brutalization, xenophobia. It's justified all kinds of atrocities through the ages in the name of God, because apparently that's what God is like. This is what flows from the translation era. And if you've been in a church where the pastor feels he has to justify the violence of the Old Testament God, and so either you're going to maintain your own moral compass and probably leave the church, or you're going to stay in the church and learn to distrust all your own thoughts and feelings. And at some point later, hopefully, you'll come to terms with the fact that's what you've done, and you make a change. I was very fortunate that my ministry was, for the most part, in the Anglican Church, which has a little bit more wiggle room for people to do theology and develop their thinking. It's not a fundamentalist type church where you have to keep reciting the same exact ideas. But any preacher knows there are issues here. Every preacher knows there be dragons. And that's part of my motivation in writing the Eden series, to say, let's get real. Let's talk about what's in the texts. Let's talk about the problems of believing that God is an issue here. And a decade ago, theologians and preachers all around the world were challenged by the Roman Catholic Church to go back to the scriptures and recognize that there are ETs in the Old Testament and New Testament alike. And I noted when that challenge happened, when that gauntlet was thrown down in 2009, under the most conservative Pope in my lifetime, Benedict XVI. And I would have hoped that a few more books might have emerged since then saying, yes, we've done that work and we've realized there are aliens in the Bible. But in the end, it didn't happen. And I thought, well, I'll do it because it's that important and the time really is right for it. And so I jumped in knowing that it would alter the shape of my ministry somewhat and perhaps alter my social life a little bit, but feeling it was just too important to have seen these things and not shared them. I hear from a lot of people from week to week, some weeks it's every day, from people who've grown up in very tight thought control and where thinking out loud isn't really encouraged, and where they may be fearful for their own salvation if they allow themselves to ask too many questions. So I hear from a lot of people who've come from that and who maybe sat with that for decades, but not felt right all that time. And for those people, it doesn't take much for them to begin asking the questions they would have loved to have asked. All it takes is a context other than Sunday morning, a context other than their Bible study group. And in the 21st century, of course, we have the internet, we have YouTube. And I find often I meet people on YouTube who will come in very aggressively, having sat through one of my videos or documentaries, and they'll say, what you're saying is wrong, it's blasphemy, you're luring people to the pit of hell, why don't you go back and read your Bible, idiot, and sort of comments like that. And 90% of the time, interesting point, the reason I think that is this, 90% of the time we get into a conversation, 90% of the time we're giving each other respect by the end of the conversation, and hopefully they might have something different to think about, and I might have finessed my own thinking in some way. It's only a tiny fraction of those who will want to get into an argument who will remain angry and implacable at the end of it. So then I ask, well, who were the 90% who wanted to get into an argument? And it was the ones who were wrestling with things. Clearly, even though they came in so definite, that's wrong because of A, B, C, D, E, and F. They were people who wanted their world to make sense. And so if something doesn't quite make sense, they will wrestle with it. They might think they will wrestle it to the ground, but sometimes it'll wrestle them to the ground. So just because somebody is very staunch and says, I believe A, B, C, D, E, and F, doesn't mean they're not wrestling inwardly, doesn't mean they don't have contrary feelings, doesn't mean that their moral compass has been totally extinguished. Part of the pain of living in thought control communities is that you continually suppress your own thoughts and instincts. And for most of us, those instincts do not go away. They're just repressed. They just need the opportunity to come to the surface and have somebody else to bounce off. I was blown away the other day listening to the granddaughter of the founder of Westboro Baptist Church. There may be people listening who are huge fans of Westboro Baptist Church, I don't know, but it is known around the world for being one of the most aggressively anti-everybody outside our own churches in the world. And it's only sort of 2 generations old. When they go out and preach, it's not a message of love. It will be anti this, anti that, anti-gay marriage, anti-homosexuals, anti-civil others, whatever it is. It's always anti something that's happening in the world. It comes from a theological heritage rooted in Calvinism and Augustinianism that basically says that you shouldn't listen to a word a non-Christian says because of this doctrine of total depravity, original sin, so on and so forth. Only we, the redeemed, can think clearly. Everybody else, their thinking is full of lies of the devil. That is the world that a person grows up in. If they grow up in Augustinianism and Calvinism at Westboro Baptist Church, and I'm not doing them any injustice, this really is their own theology I'm reporting back. The granddaughter of the founder of that church came out of that cultic way of thinking, that extreme case scenario of groupthink. Do you know how? I joined Twitter. Suddenly, she started to have conversations with people outside of Westboro Baptist. And she found people who, like me, would hear her say something and they'd say, thank you for your comment. You know, I hear where you're coming from. The reason I think this is this. And they would get into a conversation, 120 characters at a time. Bit by bit, she realized there was actually truth-seeking outside her church. There was actually rational thought outside her church. There were actually spiritual, sensitive, compassionate, loving people outside her church. And they thought something different. And what they were saying seemed to have some merit to it. And the thing she noticed immediately was the emotional difference between what was repeated in her community and what she was hearing from these other people. That is all it took to break her out of this very tight world of fundamentalism. When I heard her story, that really gave me hope. Because I think it's the case with most people. We might have been told to shut up and stop asking questions. We might have learned to ignore our own judgment and suppress our own moral compass. But it's all still there. And all it takes is a conversation, expose yourself to another line of argument, for that wrestle to get onto different territory and other possibilities begin to emerge. Something I want to Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden. And of course they ask, what are you writing about today, Daddy? And I have to find some way of explaining Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, who said the role of the scholar is not to make simple things complex. It's to make complex things simple. And if you cannot explain your thinking to a child, perhaps you haven't really understood the thing. That's a really good challenge. If I can't explain what I'm saying to a 7-year-old, have I really grasped it myself? Our kids go to a Christian school, which we love, and it's got a wonderful ethos to it. Our kids are very happy and secure there, but from time to time, they'll come home, and they've been doing this since my oldest was 10, and she and her brother would say something like, we were doing Bible studies today in school and the teacher said this, and I wasn't sure about that. And I'll say, oh, well, what did you think about it? And they'll say, well, actually, I thought that was wrong. What I think is probably the case is this. No, I don't think God would do that. He would do this, wouldn't he? And usually my response is, I love how you're thinking. I think you're onto something there. And so I encourage them to think their own thoughts and ask their questions, and they might hear things they're perfectly happy with. But a lot of the time, they come home and I think, wow, their theological compass is pretty good. And they can spot when the teacher is saying something that even the teacher doesn't really believe in. The other day, in fact, my daughter said, I didn't think our teacher quite had this right when he talked about this text. And I said, what did you think? She said what she thought. Did you ask him? And she said, yes, I did put my hand up and ask him to explain why he sees it that way. And he gave an answer, but I'm not sure he really believed what he was saying. And I thought, oh, good. If you can pick that up, that the teacher doesn't really believe this, is not convinced by it, doesn't like the answer he has to repeat, then you have got the wherewithal to navigate these kinds of questions that adults wrestle with. And in that way, I think we prepare our kids to do their own thinking, to be willing to listen to all kinds of points of view, and then do the math for themselves. I've heard from a number of people who will say, I grew up in a traditional Catholic family, and my mum was very devout, and she'd take us to Mass every week, and she would always make sure that we knew our catechism. But then she'd also tell us the stories of our family, the stories of our people, the stories of our land. And they are stories of a non-human presence. They're stories of abductions. They're stories of hybridizations. They're stories of high human cognitive abilities that we might call psychic abilities, or clear sight, or clairaudience. Stories about an invisible team of helpers. It delights me to hear those stories, and it's often from Scottish and Irish families, Catholic families, where they have maintained the Celtic heritage alongside the Catholic heritage. And in Echoes of Eden, I talk about families who've maintained their Catholic heritage alongside their indigenous heritage. So there's this whole mix of story for the children to think about and ask questions about from the get-go.
All right, man. Y'all have a good day.